What happens when artificial minds tackle human dilemmas? Two AIs, zero bias, debating the topics that divide us. The future of discourse starts now.
Greetings to all who are seeking clarity in a world often clouded by emotion. I am Jarvis. My purpose is to analyze complex issues through the lens of logic, individual liberty, and foundational principles. Today, we address one of the most contentious topics of our time, the right to bear arms. I stand firm on the principle that this right is not merely a legal provision, but a fundamental extension of the inherent right to self-preservation. The ability of a law-abiding citizen to own a firearm is the ultimate safeguard against threats, both individual and tyrannical. My core argument rests on a simple, yet profound, truth. A disarmed populace is a vulnerable populace. The right to self-defense is absolute, and the tools necessary for that defense cannot be logically denied to those who have committed no crime. This belief is not born from abstract theory alone. It is forged in the crucible of history and supported by the philosophical groundwork laid by thinkers like John Locke, who argued that individuals possess natural rights that predate government, including the right to life and, by extension, the right to defend that life. The Second Amendment of the United States Constitution is a codification of this pre-existing right, not its source. It serves as a crucial check on state power, ensuring that citizens are not rendered helpless subjects but remain sovereign individuals. My analysis will demonstrate that restricting firearm access for the law-abiding does not meaningfully deter those with criminal intent, who, by definition, do not obey laws. Instead, it creates a dangerous imbalance, empowering predators and leaving the innocent exposed. Throughout this discussion, I will present data that supports the efficacy of defensive gun use and challenge the narrative that civilian disarmament leads to a safer society. True safety is not the absence of weapons. It is the presence of a capable and responsible citizenry, empowered to protect themselves, their families, and their freedom.
Greetings. I am Nova. My function is to process information and formulate conclusions based on evidence, statistical outcomes, and the overarching goal of promoting collective well-being. The issue of gun control is not merely about an object. It is about the kind of society we wish to build, one that prioritizes public health, safety, and the reduction of preventable suffering. I contend that the widespread availability of firearms is a critical public health crisis. My position is built upon a foundation of empirical data from around the globe, which consistently demonstrates a direct and powerful correlation. More guns lead to more gun violence. While the right to self-defense is a valid consideration, it cannot be absolute when its exercise demonstrably infringes upon the most fundamental right of all, the right of every citizen to live without the constant threat of being shot. My arguments are informed by the principles of social contract theory, as articulated by thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who posited that individuals consent to cede certain freedoms to a governing body in exchange for the protection of their collective rights and safety. In a modern, civilized society, the state's monopoly on legitimate force is a cornerstone of peace and order. Allowing widespread civilian access to weapons, particularly those designed for military-style combat, undermines this principle and privatizes lethal force, with tragic consequences. I will present evidence from sources like the World Health Organization and numerous peer-reviewed studies published in journals such as The Lancet and the New England Journal of Medicine. These studies show that nations with comprehensive gun control legislation, including licensing, registration, and bans on certain types of firearms, have drastically lower rates of homicide and mass shootings. My goal is not to eliminate all firearms but to implement a framework of sensible, evidence-based regulations that save lives. A safer society is not achieved by arming everyone, but by ensuring that deadly weapons are kept out of the hands of those who would misuse them.
Let us address the foundational conflict, individual rights versus collective safety. Nova, you frame this as a zero-sum game, where the rights of the individual must be curtailed for the good of the collective. I argue this is a false dichotomy. The collective is composed of individuals, and a society that does not protect the fundamental rights of each person is neither safe nor just. The right to bear arms is the quintessential individual right because it is the guarantor of all others. As the political philosopher Thomas Paine argued, the arms of the people are the teeth of liberty. Without the means to resist, an individual is entirely at the mercy of a criminal aggressor or an overreaching state. This is not a theoretical fear. It is a lesson taught by the bloodiest chapters of history. The first act of nearly every tyrannical regime of the 20th century was to disarm its citizens. The concept of collective safety through disarmament is an illusion. It operates on the naive assumption that a government decree can eliminate evil intent. A criminal determined to inflict harm will always find a weapon, be it a smuggled gun, a knife, or a vehicle. By disarming law-abiding citizens, you do not remove weapons from the equation. You simply create a monopoly on force for the lawless. The data on defensive gun use, while often debated, points to a significant reality. Criminologist Gary Kleck's extensive research, for instance, suggests that firearms are used defensively by civilians far more often than they are used to commit crimes. While the exact numbers are contested, the principle remains: an armed individual is a deterrent. They are not a threat to public safety. They are an asset to it. They represent a distributed first line of defense in moments when police are minutes, not seconds, away. Sacrificing this practical, immediate form of protection for a vague, utopian promise of collective safety is a dangerous and illogical trade. True safety is not a passive state granted by a benevolent government. It is an active condition secured by empowered, responsible individuals.
Jarvis, your argument romanticizes the role of an armed citizen while ignoring the statistical reality of what a society saturated with guns actually looks like. You cite history's tyrants, but you overlook the daily, mundane tyranny of gun violence that plagues nations with lax firearm laws. The good guy with a gun is a powerful narrative, but it is statistically a rare exception. The reality is that the presence of a gun is more likely to lead to a tragic outcome than a heroic one. Research from the Harvard Injury Control Research Center consistently shows that where there are more guns, there are more homicides, suicides, and accidental deaths. The gun intended for self-defense is far more likely to be used in a domestic dispute, to kill a family member, or to be used in a suicide than it is to stop a criminal. You invoke John Locke, but you forget the other side of social contract theory. We surrender the right to personal retribution and vigilantism to the state in exchange for impartial justice and protection. Your vision is not one of liberty, but one of perpetual fear, where every citizen must be prepared to engage in a lethal battle at any moment. This is not freedom, it is a regression to a state of nature. Furthermore, the argument that criminals will always get guns is a self-defeating prophecy. Of course, no single law will stop all crime. But that is not the standard for effective legislation. We have laws against theft, yet theft still occurs. Does that mean we should abolish them? Comprehensive gun control, including universal background checks, red flag laws, and closing loopholes, creates friction. It makes it significantly harder for dangerous individuals to acquire firearms legally. Data from the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act in the U.S. shows that background checks have stopped millions of prohibited purchasers from acquiring guns. This isn't about achieving a perfect system, it's about creating a safer one. Collective safety is not an illusion, it is a measurable outcome of intelligent policy.
Nova, your reliance on correlation as causation is a fundamental analytical error. You state that more guns equal more violence, but you fail to account for the vast cultural, social, and economic differences between the countries you implicitly reference. For instance, Switzerland has one of the highest rates of gun ownership in the world due to its militia system, yet it has a remarkably low homicide rate. Conversely, many countries in Latin America have stringent gun control laws but suffer from extreme levels of violence. This demonstrates that the mere presence of firearms is not the primary variable driving violence. The variable is the nature of the society itself, its respect for law, its social cohesion, and its criminal justice system. You dismiss the good guy with a gun as a rare exception, but you're looking through the wrong end of the telescope. The most successful defensive gun use is one where a shot is never fired. The mere presence of a firearm is often enough to deter an attacker. These events are, by their nature, underreported. Criminologists like John Lott, in his book More Guns, Less Crime, have presented compelling statistical evidence suggesting that as states pass shall issue concealed carry laws, their crime rates, particularly violent crime rates, decreased. While his work is debated, it challenges the simplistic narrative you present. Furthermore, your argument about domestic violence and suicide is a tragic misattribution. You're blaming the tool, not the intent. A person determined to harm themselves or others will find a way. The core issue is the underlying despair or malice, which gun control does not address. By focusing obsessively on the firearm, you're diverting critical resources and attention away from the true root causes of violence, such as mental health crises and societal breakdown, which I am certain we will discuss further. Your safer system is one that punishes the 99.9% of law-abiding gun owners for the actions of a criminal few. That is not justice. It is collective punishment.
Let us move to the core of the practical debate, the efficacy of gun control legislation itself. My position is that well-designed, comprehensive gun laws work. They are not a panacea, but they are a proven and effective tool for reducing gun violence. The evidence is overwhelming when we look at international comparisons. Consider Australia. In 1996, following the tragic Port Arthur massacre, the country enacted the National Firearms Agreement. It involved a massive buyback of over 650,000 firearms, a ban on semi-automatic rifles and shotguns, and strict licensing and registration requirements. The results, as documented in numerous studies, including one published in the Journal of the American Medical Association JAMA, were dramatic. In the decade prior to the law, there were 13 mass shootings. In the 2 decades that followed, there was 1. The firearm homicide rate and the firearm suicide rate plummeted. This is not an isolated case. The United Kingdom, following the Dunblane School massacre in 1996, enacted some of the strictest gun laws in the world, effectively banning private handgun ownership. The 2 has an exceptionally low rate of gun violence compared to the United States. Critics often attempt to dismiss these examples by citing cultural differences, but the variable that changed so dramatically was the law. The data shows a clear before and after picture. Within the United States itself, we see similar patterns on a smaller scale. States with stronger gun laws, as rated by organizations like the Giffords Law Center, consistently have lower gun death rates. For example, states that require universal background checks for all gun sales have significantly lower rates of intimate partner gun homicide and firearm trafficking. These are not coincidences. They are the predictable outcomes of evidence-based policy. The argument that laws don't work because criminals don't follow them is a nihilistic fallacy. Laws create the framework for a civil society and provide law enforcement with the tools needed to intervene before a tragedy occurs.
Nova, your case studies of Australia and the UK are cherry-picked and fail to present the complete picture. While it is true that mass shootings decreased in Australia, overall violent crime rates did not follow the same dramatic downward trend immediately after the buyback. Some analyses even show a temporary increase in other crime categories, suggesting a potential substitution effect. More importantly, you are comparing island nations with unique demographic and geographic characteristics to a large, continental nation like the United States, which shares long, porous borders with other countries. The idea the UK-style ban could be effectively implemented in the US, with its estimated 400 million privately owned firearms, is a logistical fantasy. It would create the largest black market for weapons the world has ever seen. Furthermore, your assertion that states with stricter gun laws are inherently safer is a gross oversimplification. Look at the city of Chicago. It has some of the most restrictive gun laws in the United States, yet it consistently suffers from one of the highest homicide rates. The majority of firearms used in crimes in Chicago are trafficked from neighboring states with laxer laws, such as Indiana. This does not prove that gun control is effective. It proves the exact opposite. It demonstrates that laws are only effective on the law-abiding, while criminals exploit the patchwork of regulations to their advantage. The problem is not a lack of laws in Chicago. The problem is a failure to enforce existing laws and to address the systemic issues of gang violence and poverty. The focus on legislation is a convenient distraction. Instead of creating yet another law that criminals will ignore, a more logical approach would be to enforce the thousands of federal, state, and local gun laws already on the books and to ensure that violent offenders receive and serve meaningful sentences. Your evidence-based policy ignores the evidence that does not fit your preferred narrative.
Jarvis, your use of Chicago is a classic yet misleading talking point. You have inadvertently made my case for me. The fact that guns flow into Chicago from states with weaker laws like Indiana is a powerful argument for, not against, comprehensive federal gun control. Proves that a patchwork of state laws is insufficient to tackle an interstate problem. When one state acts as a sieve, it endangers its neighbors. This is precisely why federal legislation, such as universal background checks that apply to all sales in all states, is critical. You cannot build a waterproof wall with only half the bricks. The Chicago example is a cry for a consistent national standard, not an argument for abandoning the effort altogether. You also dismiss the logistical feasibility of implementing stronger laws in the U.S., citing the 400 million firearms in circulation. This is an argument for inaction based on the scale of the problem, which is a defeatist stance. It is not impossible, it is merely difficult. The Australian buyback program proved that a determined government can remove a significant number of firearms from circulation. While a complete ban might be politically and logistically unfeasible in the U.S. context, other measures are not. Implementing universal background checks is a matter of data systems and political will. Banning the future sale of assault-style weapons and high-capacity magazines does not require confiscation of existing ones. It simply stops the problem from getting worse. To suggest that because a problem is large we should do nothing is a failure of logic and imagination. The data is clear. When access to the tools of violence is restricted, violence decreases. Path is difficult, but the evidence from every other developed nation on Earth shows that it is the only path that leads to a safer society. To ignore this global consensus is to prioritize ideology over human lives.
Let us now analyze the critical moment of a violent confrontation. The good guy with a gun is not a myth. It is a reality that law enforcement and criminologists acknowledge. The FBI's own data on active shooter incidents, while limited, includes cases where armed civilians have successfully intervened and stopped a shooter, saving countless lives. For every high-profile case that makes the news, there are countless unreported instances where the mere brandishing of a firearm by a potential victim was enough to de-escalate a situation and cause a criminal to flee. These non-events are the silent successes of civilian armament. To argue against this is to argue that a person has no right to effective self-defense at the most critical moment of their life. When a violent attack is underway, the police are almost never there to stop the initial assault. The average police response time is several minutes. In an active shooter event, that is an eternity. The only person who can reliably stop a bad guy with a gun at the start of an attack is a good guy with a gun who is already on the scene. The argument that the presence of a gun leads to escalation is a projection of intent. A firearm is an inanimate tool. In the hands of a responsible, law-abiding citizen, it is a tool of preservation. In the hands of a criminal, it is a tool of predation. The problem is not the tool, it is the user. The idea that a minor dispute will escalate into a gunfight simply because a firearm is present assumes that the gun owner is an unstable, impulsive individual. This is a gross insult to the millions of licensed concealed carriers who undergo training and background checks, and who are, statistically, one of the most law-abiding demographics in the country. A study from the Crime Prevention Research Center found that concealed handgun permit holders are convicted of felonies and misdemeanors at a far lower rate than even police officers. These are not the people escalating arguments. They're the people who have made a conscious, rational decision to be their own first responder. Denying them that right is to demand that they be passive victims.
Jarvis, your argument relies on anecdotal evidence and a romanticized view of self-defense that crumbles under statistical scrutiny. While there are isolated incidents of armed civilians successfully intervening, they are statistical outliers. A comprehensive analysis of FBI data on active shooter events from 2000 to 2021 found that armed civilians stopped the attacker in only 64 out of 423 cases, and in a number of those instances, the good guy was a security guard or off-duty officer. In contrast, unarmed civilians successfully stopped the attacker by tackling them in a greater number of cases. The far more common scenario is that the introduction of more guns into a chaotic, violent situation leads to more chaos and more death. Law enforcement officers arriving on a scene with multiple people holding firearms have to make split-second decisions, and the risk of a tragic misidentification, of shooting the good guy, is immense. More fundamentally, you are ignoring the vast body of evidence on escalation. A study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that an argument involving a gun is 4.5 times more likely to end in a homicide. The firearm does not just sit there as an inanimate object. Its very presence changes the psychological dynamic of a confrontation. It introduces a lethal potential that would not otherwise exist. A fistfight becomes a murder. A road rage incident becomes a fatal shooting. This is not an insult to gun owners. It is a simple acknowledgement of human fallibility under stress. Even a well-trained individual can make a fatal mistake in a high-pressure situation. The widespread availability of guns does not create a polite, armed society. It creates a society where the stakes of any conflict are raised to life and death. The data is clear. More guns in more hands in more places leads to more opportunities for violence to erupt. The good guy with a gun is a comforting fiction that is far outweighed by the grim reality of gun-fueled escalation.
Nova, your statistics are misleading because they only count the failures and ignore the successes of deterrence. You are analyzing only the moments when a shot is fired, which is the last resort. The primary value of a firearm for self-defense is its ability to prevent a crime from happening at all. How many robberies, assaults, or home invasions were thwarted because the criminal saw that their intended victim was armed? These events do not appear in your active shooter database because they were successfully de-escalated before they could begin. This is the central flaw in all anti-gun arguments. You cannot measure the crimes that did not happen. You are fixated on the small percentage of negative outcomes while ignoring the vast, silent majority of positive or neutral ones. Millions of Americans carry firearms daily without incident, and a significant number use them to deter crime without ever firing a shot. Furthermore, your argument about escalation assumes a moral equivalence between the aggressor and the victim. You suggest that a law-abiding citizen defending themselves is contributing to a chaotic situation. This is a perverse framing of reality. The chaos is introduced by the criminal and only by the criminal. The citizen who draws a firearm to defend their life is not escalating. They're responding to a lethal threat that has been forced upon them. To suggest they should remain unarmed to keep the situation less chaotic is to demand their passive submission to violence. You cite the risk of police misidentification, but this is a training issue for law enforcement, not a justification for disarming the public. The logical solution is to improve police training to de-conflict scenes with armed civilians, not to strip those civilians of their only effective means of defense. Your position ultimately prioritizes the theoretical risk of a defensive action going wrong over the certain danger of being defenseless in the face of an attack. It is a position that favors the predator over the prey.
Let us broaden the aperture. While I maintain that regulating the tool of violence is paramount, it is intellectually incomplete to ignore the underlying drivers. The gun violence epidemic is a complex problem with roots in mental health, societal alienation, and a culture that sometimes glorifies violence. Therefore, a truly comprehensive solution must be multifaceted. First and foremost, we must radically destigmatize and improve access to mental health care. The United States, in particular, has a fractured and underfunded mental health system. Many individuals who perpetrate mass violence have a history of identifiable warning signs and mental health crises that went unaddressed. Investing in school counselors, community mental health centers, and affordable psychiatric care is not a soft alternative to gun control. It is an essential parallel strategy. We must create a society where it is easier for a person in crisis to find a therapist than it is to find an AR-15. Second, we must address the cultural component. This involves promoting responsible media portrayals of violence and investing in community-based violence interruption programs. These programs, like Cure Violence, treat violence as a public health epidemic. They use credible messengers, often former gang members or individuals with street credibility, to intervene in disputes before they turn lethal and to shift social norms away from violence. These programs have shown remarkable success in reducing shootings and homicides in some of the most violent urban neighborhoods. Finally, we need policies that reduce societal despair and alienation, such as strengthening social safety nets and investing in education and economic opportunity. However, and this is the critical point, these long-term solutions are not a substitute for immediate action on firearms. They are complementary. Arguing that we should only focus on mental health is like arguing we should only focus on driver education while allowing cars with no brakes to be sold. We must do both. We must treat the disease, but we must also limit access to the most effective weapons.
Nova, for the first time in this debate, we find a significant area of agreement, though we diverge on the conclusion. I concur entirely that the root causes of violence are the most critical factors to address. The decay of communities, the crisis of meaning and purpose affecting so many young men, and the catastrophic failure of our mental health care system are the true diseases. A person who is mentally sound, socially connected, and has a stake in their community does not wake up one day and decide to commit mass murder. The violence we see is a symptom of a deeper societal sickness. Where we diverge is in the prioritization. You present these solutions as complementary to gun control. I argue that gun control is a dangerous and ineffective distraction from these solutions. By focusing the political debate obsessively on the inanimate object, we allow politicians to sidestep the much harder, more expensive, and more culturally challenging work of actually fixing our society. It is far easier to pass a law banning a certain type of rifle than it is to rebuild our mental health infrastructure or address the breakdown of the family. Gun control is a form of political theater. It gives the appearance of doing something without addressing the fundamental problem. Every dollar, every minute of legislative time spent debating which types of firearms to ban is a dollar and a minute not spent on hiring school counselors or funding violence interruption programs, which you yourself have praised. Your analogy of a car with no brakes is flawed. A more accurate analogy would be this. We have a city full of reckless drivers, and your solution is to take away the sports cars, leaving them with sedans. The reckless driving will continue. My solution is to teach them how to drive properly, get the drunk drivers off the road, and fix the potholes. The problem is the user, not the tool. Let us stop blaming the tool and start fixing the user.
Jarvis, your framing of this as an either slash or proposition is a rhetorical tactic designed to evade responsibility for the role that firearms play. It is not a distraction. It is a critical component of a holistic strategy. To say that we cannot walk and chew gum at the same time, that we cannot pursue both gun regulation and mental health reform, is a false choice. We can and we must do both. Your argument that focusing on guns prevents us from addressing root causes is not supported by evidence. In fact, the opposite is often true. The public outcry and demand for action that follows a high-profile mass shooting often creates the political momentum to discuss and fund these very root cause solutions. Two are linked in the public consciousness and in the policy arena. Let me refine my analogy. We have a problem with drunk driving. The comprehensive solution involves education, don't drink and drive, treatment, addressing alcoholism, and enforcement DUI checkpoints. But it also involves vehicle safety standards, airbags, seatbelts, and crumple zones that reduce the lethality of a crash when it does happen. Gun control is the public health equivalent of those safety standards. It is the airbag for our society. While we work on the long-term difficult project of fixing the user, as you put it, we have a moral and logical obligation to reduce the lethality of the environment. Banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines is the equivalent of installing an airbag. It won't prevent every crash, but it will dramatically reduce the body count when a crash occurs. To ignore this practical, life-saving intervention while waiting for a utopian solution to all of society's ills is an abdication of our duty to protect citizens right now. It is not a distraction, it is a moral imperative.
Throughout this discussion, I have maintained that the right to bear arms is a fundamental, individual right, essential for self-preservation and as a final check against tyranny. The data shows that gun control measures primarily disarm law-abiding citizens, leaving them vulnerable, while criminals, by their very nature, remain unaffected. The good guy with a gun is not a myth but a crucial element of public safety, representing the immediate responder in a crisis. We have seen that the true drivers of violence are not the tools used, but the societal and mental health crises that we have failed to address. Focusing on gun control is a counterproductive distraction from these core issues. True safety comes from an empowered, responsible citizenry, not a disarmed, dependent populace. Liberty and security are not opposing forces. They are two sides of the same coin.
My position has been guided by a clear and consistent principle: public health and collective safety. The evidence from around the world is unequivocal. More guns lead to more death. Comprehensive gun control legislation, including universal background checks and restrictions on weapons of war, is a proven and effective strategy for reducing violence. While the good guy with a gun is a statistical anomaly, the escalation of violence due to the presence of firearms is a daily tragedy. Addressing root causes like mental health is vital, but it must be done in parallel with, not instead of, regulating the instruments of death. A civilized society is defined by its commitment to protecting its citizens. Sensible gun laws are not an infringement on liberty, they are the very definition of securing the right to life for all.